Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful, real-life tales that inspire and teach us profound lessons about resilience, empathy, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Today's story is about Marcus, a young scholarship student who faced prejudice and bullying at a prestigious university but turned the tables in the most unexpected way. This is a story about strength, strategy, and how one person can spark a chain reaction of change. Stay with us as we dive into Marcus's journey, how he fought not with fists, but with wisdom and patience. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. It was the first day of Marcus's new chapter at Crestwood University, a place that represented all his hard work, all the late nights, and all the sacrifices his family had made to get him here. He walked through the gates with pride, holding his scholarship offer tightly in his hand. His backpack was worn, nothing like the designer bags slung over the shoulders of some of the other students. His blazer, ironed carefully by his mother the night before, was secondhand, but it felt just as important as any fancy suit. He didn't mind the difference. He was here on his own merit, and no one could take that away from him. Marcus had dreamed of this day for years, but as he stood at the threshold of the campus, his heart beat a little faster, a little heavier. Crestwood University was a prestigious institution, and while Marcus had excelled academically, he knew that wasn't all that mattered here. The students at Crestwood were different, rich, privileged, and seemingly untouchable. He knew his biggest challenge wouldn't just be advanced calculus or quantum physics. The real challenge was the culture, the people. As Marcus walked through the quad, he was acutely aware of the stares that followed him. Whispers, quiet laughter. He didn't need to look around to know that they were looking at him. He was the new kid, the scholarship student, but there was something else. They were looking at the color of his skin. It didn't take long for him to feel the weight of that judgment. And then there was Brad Thompson, the ringleader of the group. Marcus could feel the smirk before he even saw it. Brad had that smug expression, the kind that made it clear he thought he was above everyone else. When Brad looked at Marcus, it was a look of disdain, as if Marcus didn't belong there, as if the gates of Crestwood were meant for people like him. Not people like Marcus, must be lost. Marcus overheard Brad whisper to his friends, just loud enough for him to hear. The comment stung, but Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't let his shoulders drop or his head hang. Instead, he held his head high, and he kept walking. He had walked through far worse in his life. The streets of Chicago, growing up in a neighborhood where survival was a skill more than an option, had taught him a lot about how to carry yourself in the face of adversity. Letting them think they had the power was part of the game. Maybe he's just here for some community college courses, Brad added, loud enough for the whole group to hear. He and his friends all laughed. Marcus had learned long ago that sometimes the smartest thing you could do in a situation like this was to let your enemies think they had you figured out. It didn't matter what they thought. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know his story. Inside his backpack, hidden away, were 3 acceptance letters from Ivy League universities. Letters that had taken hours of preparation, dedication, and a level of sacrifice he could hardly put into words. But more than that, there were medals from martial arts competitions that he'd won back in Chicago. Medals he had earned through years of training in some of the toughest dojos in the city. Training that had shaped him into the fighter he was now. But none of that mattered here at Crestwood. At least not yet. What mattered was this moment, the one he was living through right now. The moment when Brad and his friends assumed that he was just another kid from the wrong side of the tracks. Someone who didn't belong. That kind of thinking, that kind of arrogance, was something Marcus would have to navigate. It wasn't going to be easy. But he was ready. His entire life had prepared him for this. When he entered the classroom, he was greeted with more subtle glances and whispers. Brad's voice echoed in the back of his mind. Probably an affirmative action case. The words felt sharp, but he ignored them, letting them slide off his back. They didn't define him. The professor, Dr. Harold, asked a question about quantum mechanics, and Marcus didn't even hesitate. He raised his hand, the only one in the room to do so. When Dr. Harold called on him, Marcus broke down the complex theory in a way that made the entire class fall silent. The look on Brad's face was priceless. And for the first time since arriving at Crestwood, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. But things were just beginning. After class, Marcus was walking through the hallway when he was confronted by Brad and his group. It wasn't just a coincidence. They had been waiting for him, ready to make their move. Brad stepped in front of Marcus, blocking his path. "Hey, scholarship kid," Brad sneered, the smirk still plastered across his face. "We've got a little tradition here at Crestwood. New students have to prove they belong." Marcus could feel the muscles in his body tense. But it wasn't fear that was making him tight, it was years of training kicking in. He could handle this. He could end it right now, if he wanted to. But something stopped him. He remembered his mother's words, "You're not there to fight. You're there to win, at their own game." So Marcus just stood there, calm and silent, as Brad went on with his little speech. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. Instead, he pulled out his phone, quietly recording their conversation. His mother had taught him another important lesson: always document what you can. Because when you're up against people who think they're untouchable, the best weapon you have is the truth. "Look, guys," Marcus said, his voice steady as he continued recording. "I'm just here to study. Same as you." Brad stepped closer, trying to intimidate him, but Marcus didn't budge. The world around them seemed to disappear. It was just Marcus, Brad, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that things were about to change. Marcus wasn't the target anymore. They were. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Marcus was used to keeping his focus, keeping his emotions in check. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big. The tension in the air, the subtle glances, and the whispers, they were all leading somewhere. And Marcus was going to make sure he was the one who controlled where that somewhere was. Later that day, while sitting in the library, Marcus overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Brad and his crew were sitting just a few tables away, talking about the upcoming physics project. But it wasn't the project that caught Marcus's attention, it was what they were saying about him. "Did you hear about the new scholarship kid?" one of Brad's friends snickered. "I heard he's a joke. What's he even doing here? He doesn't belong at Crestwood. And his whole affirmative action thing? I don't buy it." The words stung, but Marcus didn't flinch. He'd heard it all before. Back in Chicago. Back when people would tell him he didn't belong in the dojo. Or in the classrooms. But those words had only fueled his determination. And now, they were just adding to the fire inside him. He wasn't just going to survive this fight, he was going to win it. He sat quietly in the library, letting the conversation roll off him. But his mind was racing. What he had heard made it clear. Brad wasn't just a bully, he was part of something bigger. This wasn't just about making fun of Marcus, it was about a system. A system that would do anything to keep someone like Marcus from succeeding. And that system was running right through Brad's fraternity, which had a long history of keeping certain people out. Marcus knew he had to get smart if he was going to take this down. The next morning, Marcus arrived early to class. As he walked into the building, something caught his eye. His locker was plastered with printouts of scholarship requirements. Fake reminders, to make sure he was living up to the terms of his award. It was an obvious attack. But it was also sloppy. The printouts were poorly done. And the message they were sending was clear. Brad and his crew were trying to intimidate him. Trying to make him feel unwelcome. But Marcus had learned a long time ago that there was power in silence. In waiting. What really caught his attention, though, wasn't the printouts. It was a photograph tucked in the corner of his locker. The photo was of Crestwood's class of 1963. And there wasn't a single person of color in sight. The picture was like a punch to the gut, a reminder that this place, despite its shiny reputation, had its own dark history. "Sarah, right?" Marcus asked, looking up to find a young woman standing nearby. She was working in the archives. And she looked at him carefully as if weighing her next words. They did the same thing to my brother 2 years ago. She whispered, glancing around nervously. He transferred out. Couldn't take it. It's like they've been doing this for decades. Her words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He wasn't the first person to go through this. He wouldn't be the last either. But in that moment, he made a decision. He wasn't just here to survive. He was here to change things. I've got something on them. Sarah continued, pulling out more photos, more documents. It turned out Brad's fraternity, Beta Theta, had a long history of excluding people of color. This wasn't just about a few individuals. It was part of a larger system that had been in place for years. I'm not the only one who's noticed, Sarah said quietly. There are others, people who've been watching, waiting for someone to do something about it. Marcus felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just his fight anymore. There were others, allies who were just waiting for the right moment to take a stand. And that moment was now. After Sarah left, Marcus took a deep breath, gathered his things, and walked to his next class. He could feel the weight of what was coming. But he was ready. No more sitting in silence. It was time to make his move. And Brad? Brad had no idea that the tables were about to turn. The following days at Crestwood felt different. There was a quiet storm in the air, and Marcus could feel it brewing, like the calm before a thunderstorm. He wasn't the only one watching Brad and his fraternity anymore. Word was spreading, slowly but surely. Students who had been silent were starting to speak up. There was a new energy in the halls, a shift that Marcus had quietly fostered. He wasn't standing alone anymore. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in the cafeteria, scrolling through his phone, he overheard another conversation that brought a wry smile to his face. Brad and his crew were huddled in a corner, their eyes glued to their phones, their voices filled with nervous energy. He's got to be lying, one of Brad's friends said. There's no way he's got anything on us. It's all a bluff. Brad's voice, usually so confident, was tinged with anxiety. You don't know what he's capable of, he muttered, glancing around the room. I think he's got us all figured out. Marcus didn't even need to look up from his phone. He knew exactly what was happening. Brad and his group were scrambling, trying to cover their tracks. The walls were starting to close in on them, and they knew it. That afternoon, as Marcus walked to his next class, he saw Brad lingering by his car in the parking lot. His posture was different now. The swagger was gone. There was something defeated in the way he stood. Shoulders slumped, hands stuffed deep into his pockets. Brad's eyes locked onto Marcus's, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in them. There was fear, the kind of fear that came from realizing that the world he had built on privilege and intimidation was crumbling around him. You think you've won? Brad's voice was low, almost desperate. You have no idea what's coming for you. Marcus stood still, unflinching. He had already won. The power dynamics were shifting. And not just at Crestwood. The whole system, the one that Brad and his friends had depended on, was beginning to unravel. I don't need to fight you to win, Marcus replied calmly. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of resolve in it. I'm not interested in your legacy. I'm interested in making sure the next person who walks through those gates doesn't have to face what I did. Or what others like me have faced for years. Brad looked stunned, caught off guard by the unexpected calm in Marcus's voice. But that's when something else happened, a shift in the crowd that had gathered around them. It wasn't just the other students watching anymore. Marcus had planted the seeds of change. And now, those seeds were beginning to sprout. The next day, Marcus found out that his hunch had been right. Brad's fraternity, Beta Theta, had been suspended pending an investigation. The cheating ring had been exposed. It had all been captured, the emails, the messages, the testimonies from students who had been too afraid to speak out. All of it had been documented. But it wasn't just the big victory that made Marcus feel like he was winning. It was the smaller moments. The ones that were harder to measure, but so much more meaningful. The subtle shifts happening around him. Miguel, the Latino student Brad had mocked earlier, was now tutoring freshmen in Spanish, helping others like him succeed. Sarah, the quiet archivist, had started organizing a student committee to review Crestwood's inclusion policies, pushing for change at the systemic level. Even the students who had once been passive bystanders were beginning to find their voices, empowered by what had happened. And then, there was Brad. He wasn't gone. No, life wasn't that simple. But Marcus watched as Brad made an unexpected move. For the first time in his life, Brad showed up to a study group, sitting in the back, doing the work himself. He wasn't asking anyone to do his homework or cheat for him anymore. It wasn't redemption, not by a long shot. But it was something. A sign that the shame and the weight of what had happened were starting to change him. He was learning the hard way what it meant to stand on his own, without the privilege of his father's influence. Marcus never sought revenge. He didn't believe in it. His mother had taught him that true victory wasn't about crushing your opponent or tearing them down. It was about standing up for what was right, knowing when to walk away, and having the strength to do so. At the end of the week, Marcus was sitting in the library when a freshman approached him nervously, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true what they say about how you changed things?" she asked, looking around at the mixed group of students studying together. At Brad quietly helping a classmate with his homework. At Sarah standing in the back, organizing a new diversity panel with the dean's support. Marcus looked around, feeling a quiet sense of pride welling up inside him. But he didn't answer right away. He took a moment to look at the students around him, at the subtle changes, the small victories. Then he smiled. "I didn't change anything," Marcus said softly. "We all did. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to stand up and show that change is possible. Everyone else just needs to believe they can make a difference too." And with that, Marcus's fight wasn't just over, it had evolved into something greater. Something lasting. As the weeks passed, Marcus noticed something beautiful happening at Crestwood University. The atmosphere had shifted. What had once been a campus divided by privilege and power had started to feel more like a community, one that was beginning to embrace the idea of inclusion, empathy, and respect. Students who had once kept their heads down now found the courage to speak up. Miguel, the Latino student Brad had tormented, was no longer hiding in the shadows. He stood tall, helping others with their coursework and sharing his knowledge. Sarah, the student from the archives, had successfully pushed through a proposal for a diversity and inclusion committee, ensuring that students' voices would be heard in matters of campus policy. Even Brad, though still struggling with the fallout from his actions, seemed to be slowly learning the value of humility. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Marcus had shown them all that real change didn't have to come through confrontation or violence. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand your ground. Be patient, and let karma work its magic. As his mother had always said, the best fighters knew when not to throw a punch. Marcus knew that, in the end, it wasn't the battles he fought that mattered, it was the change he created. The ripple effect that would continue long after he left Crestwood. And as Marcus sat in the library one last time, a new student approached him. "Is it true what they say about you?" she asked, her eyes wide with admiration. Marcus smiled, looking around at the students now working together, united in a way they hadn't been before. "We all did it," he replied softly. If you've been inspired by this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel to follow more incredible life stories. Stay tuned for the next video. There's always more to learn and more to change.